Welcome in everybody to my next edition of my roster review series here on the channel with a look into the Calgary Stampeders, a team that I think people are starting to underestimate after all these years of dominance that they've had in the regular season. At least they've kind of been the New England Patriots of the CFL for a while now, and this year I think a lot of people are kind of calling their death here, and they're saying that this roster isn't as good as it used to be, and there are a lot of holes and whatnot, and Bo Levi Mitchell's coming off injuries. We'll get into all of that coming up in this video. But really quickly, just wanted to shout all you out. The support for these videos has been outstanding, and I appreciate all of it. Make sure to hit the like button. It lets me know that you like the content. And with that said, let's dive into today's schedule. So we'll start with the positional rankings, where every position ranks in the CFL relative to every other team. And then we'll go into projected starters / ratio possibilities, where they're to start the Canadians this year. And then I'm going to do my team award predictions, such as most outstanding player. And then finally, I'll give my final thoughts, little prediction, and a big question surrounding the team this year. And as a reminder, there are timestamps in the description, so if you want to skip forward to the point in the video that you just want to see, there you go. So we'll start off with the quarterback position, which is actually going to rank first in the CFL, and it's all because of Bo Levi Mitchell, who I still consider to be the best quarterback in the CFL. 2 Grey Cup championships, I believe 4 Grey Cup appearances if I'm not mistaken. Just been so consistent in terms of winning football games. Maybe not the most complete quarterback in terms of a skill set perspective. He's not much of a scrambler really at all. But in terms of just the pocket presence, the confidence to make the tight window throws, to give his receivers chances to make plays, there's no one better at taking those calculated risks than Bo Levi. And that's really what you got to do in the CFL game, because you only have a certain amount of plays to make it count. With that one less down, you got to take your chances and make those chunk plays. And Bo Levi's just been so consistent at finding the balance between, taking the check down and taking a chance down the field, and just been such an effective quarterback over his CFL tenure. And that's why the Calgary Stampeders have basically been the most dominant team in the CFL over the past decade or so. And then behind him in this depth chart, you have Michael O'Connor, who's the Canadian quarterback that was selected in the 3rd round in 2019 by Toronto. He was under contract for 2020, but then of course there was no contract freeze, and so he becomes a free agent this offseason, signs in Calgary. And I think this is a really great fit because Calgary has shown a willingness in the past with Brad Sinopoli to develop a Canadian quarterback and give them legit reps in practice and whatnot. O'Connor, he has all the tools. He has a big arm. He's a big guy. He's like 6'4". And he even got into a bit of action late in the 2019 season with Toronto, and he looked pretty good. He looked the part. So he's going to be competing for the backup role here in Calgary, and I'm really excited to see what he can do as a developmental prospect in this offense. Now, competing with him is Dakota Prukup, his fellow backup from Toronto back in 2019, a guy that likewise saw a little bit of action at the back end of that season. More of an athletic type quarterback, really good in terms of just scrambling around, buying time, and making a play with it. Maybe not so developed in terms of the other aspects of playing quarterback from the limited time we've seen, but again, not too much of a sample size there, so we can't really make too much of a judgment there. But those 2 guys, I presume one of those guys will be the number 2 quarterback. CFL teams can dress only a minimum of 2 quarterbacks, which is different this year than in past years, where I think you had to dress 3 quarterbacks on game day. So being a 2nd versus a 3rd quarterback now in the CFL is such a big deal. The other guy in this quarterback room is Jake Maier, who went to UC Davis and was the 2018 Big Sky Offensive Player of the Year. So big accomplishments in his college career. Let's see if it translates to the CFL. At the running back position, they're going to rank 8th in the CFL. There's just not a lot of proven guys right now in terms of guys that have carried the load in a CFL offense. So the guy I'm most confident is going to be the starting running back in this offense is Kadeem Carey, who came over to Calgary in 2019, was a former 3rd round pick of the Chicago Bears, and saw a good amount of action in the NFL prior to coming to the CFL. One of his first major highlights was actually a special teams play where he actually blocked a punt and returned it for a touchdown. Was really impressed by that, and clearly Calgary was too, because in the ensuing weeks, he actually got more and more of a role on offense. That kind of stuff will prove you to coaches. If you do something on special teams, it really shows you that, a player desperately wants it. And Kadeem Carey really proved that by playing the special teams units early on in his CFL career. And now he's set up for a pretty big role, I would say, going into this season. He has a good amount of burst and is not necessarily the most physical runner in the world, but we'll see what he brings to the table after having a couple seasons off now to kind of prepare for this running back job here in Calgary. And then Ante Milanovic-Leader, a Canadian running back that is more of kind of a fullback type body, a big bruising guy that doesn't have a lot of wiggle but has a lot of power. He's kind of slow, but he's really good in pass protection in terms of picking up blitzes, and I think that's why he found his way onto a pretty decent role in 2019 with Calgary. Started a few games here and has been with the team for a few years now, so we'll see. He's always going to be a pretty key piece on special teams, but I think if you want him to be your lead back, that's not the role that he should be playing at the CFL level. He should be kind of a short yardage kind of back that could start a game here or there, but you shouldn't count on him to be your full-time starter. And then Trey Williams, he was actually a part of the Argos practice squad in 2017, but has had a journeyman-like pro career to this point, with stops in the NFL as well as the AAF and XFL. He's more of a smaller jitterbug kind of runner, so more of that lateral agility and less of that downfield explosiveness, but we'll see how he fits in if he makes the roster here. And then Rock Thomas, a former Jacksonville State running back, played a handful of games for the Vikings back in 2018, actually saw the field a little bit. So we'll see if he brings anything to the table as a rookie here at the CFL level. And then Charlie Power and William Longley, two guys that are primarily fullback types that are going to contribute on special teams. Both those guys have been here for a few years now, and that's what you can expect out of those two guys. Not really a factor in terms of carrying the ball for this offense. Now, at the wide receiver position, they're going to rank 8th as well. And just the reason for this, because there are talented players in this unit. It's just there are a lot of questions pertaining to health and consistency, I think. And that's really what drags it down among the several really good receiving corps in the CFL. As I said in the last video, Montreal ranked 7th, and I really like the receiving corps, and likewise, I like a lot of these pieces, and I think they have the potential to outperform this ranking by season end. So we'll start with Kamar Jordan, a guy who was just an electric receiver back in 2018 with Calgary, and then in the playoff game, he actually suffered a very serious knee injury, and then missed almost the entire 2019 season and came back for the playoff game, where he didn't do too much, but that's hard to expect a guy to come in after such a long time off. But just to see that he came back late in that season, pretty incredible. But before his injury, this guy was arguably in the conversation for the best receiver in the CFL. Just an explosive player, but we'll see if he retained all of that explosiveness after his injury. And then Hergy Mayala, a guy that, this is my prediction, I think he, by the end of the season, everybody will know him as the best Canadian receiver in the CFL. He's just such a special talent, and he just sticks out to you from the eye test. Just a big body guy, has the explosiveness as well. He started developing chemistry late in his rookie season with Bo Levi Mitchell, where I think he had a handful of touchdowns in the last 9 games of the season. I'm so excited for Mayala's future here in the CFL. Breaking onto the field at such a young age, was their first round pick back in the 2019 draft, and just a very explosive, big body Canadian receiver that has all the potential in the world. And then we move on to a guy like Markeith Ambles, who's a guy that has the potential athletically to be a CFL star, but you just need to see the consistency in terms of the hands, in terms of the route running. There have been times where Bo Levi Mitchell and him have not been on the same page, and there was also situations where he had opportunities to make plays that he dropped the ball, inconsistent hands. So we'll see how he plays this year. I've heard really great reports so far in training camp that he's actually playing extremely well. So I'm really excited to see him play this season. I think he's a potential breakout player for this unit. And then Josh Huff, another former NFLer who was a third-round pick of the Philadelphia Eagles. He came over in the 2019 season, and he actually got onto the field basically right away. So that was a great sign for this offense. Provided a lot of good value. He provided some value as a kick returner as well. I'm just really excited to see what he brings here in year 2 after, again, like breaking onto the field so early in his CFL tenure despite having to learn a brand new game. That's kind of an underrated aspect of when players come over to the league. And Huff, a guy that's always had the athletic potential. It's just all about putting all the fundamentals and aspects of his game together. And that's probably why he failed in the NFL. So we'll see if he can do that at the CFL level. And then a really interesting Canadian receiving room behind my alley here with Colton Hunchak and Richie Sindani. So Hunchak was actually the last pick in the 2019 CFL draft, and he was already getting onto the field as a rookie. He not only made the team, but he was actually catching passes as a rookie. Super impressive guy coming out of York, at university that doesn't typically produce a lot of CFL talent. So Hunchak, really impressive guy. Really excited to see if he finds his way back into a prominent role in this offense. But obviously with Mayala here, I don't know if they're going to start 2 receivers. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then Sindani was actually this offense's Canadian starting receiver to begin last season, and he's a guy that's never really impressed me all too much. He doesn't really have that after the catch ability on any of his catches that I've seen that displays explosiveness to really take this offense to the next level. But he's a good possession receiver, so to speak. He'll find the holes in the zone, sit down, make a little catch for you here or there, but just not a very explosive player. Another Canadian is Luther Hakanuvahu. I probably said that name so wrong. I am so sorry. But a guy that was a 6'4 receiver that had a productive last season at York. He was Calgary's 5th round pick in 2021, so the most recent draft. So we'll see what he brings to the table. Apparently, again, I've been reading that there are really good reports from him out of training camp as well. And then we'll go back up a little bit to Dorian Baker, who was a former Kentucky Wildcats receiver. He wasn't a very productive receiver while playing in college in the SEC, but is a big, strong receiver that many have long thought possesses incredible potential just because of his athletic profile. And then you got a guy in Aaron Bonds who went to Utah State, was another player under contract since the 2020 season. He's been waiting to make his debut for a long time and actually played a bit of both receiver and running back at the college level. So keep an eye out for that if he makes the team. And then Andres Salgado, a global player here, was the team's 1st round pick in 2019 in the Mexican CFL draft. So we'll see if he's the global player that sticks around on this roster. Now, on the offensive line, they're going to rank 5th. And this may surprise some people given their off-season losses, but they lost Shane Bergman, who was arguably one of the best offensive linemen in the CFL at the guard position. And they also lost their veteran tackler, Neela Kasatati. Bergman, huge loss, I totally agree. But Kasatati, when he retired a few weeks ago, I wasn't all that torn up about it. I think his film in 2019 was pretty lacking, and so I thought Calgary could probably do better at that right tackle spot. I don't think it was too big of a loss there, and that's why I didn't really drag them down too much. And there are other units in the league that I have more questions about than this one, especially with like a core 3 guys in Sean McEwen, Ryan Sevier, and Akamri Williams. So McEwen is actually going to make his Stampeders debut this season after signing with Calgary in the 2020 season. He comes home to Alberta, a really good starting center who's really going to excel at the pass protection aspect of playing center. Not really too much of a mauler per se, but very, very effective in terms of coordinating the line and holding that pivot spot, so to speak, in the middle of the offensive line as a pass protector. And then Ryan Sevier, a Canadian lineman that plays that right guard position and is very effective as a run blocker, so he's kind of the opposite of McEwen here. He has his issues in pass protection, but you live with that because Sevier is a plus in the run game, and him and Bergman were such a tandem at that guard position. But Sevier's still here, and he's going to really help bring up that running back room that like I said, ranked pretty low in the CFL. And then Acombre Williams was actually this team's starting center in 2019, but he has some experience in the past playing left tackle. So that is the plan, reportedly, that he's going to move from center to left tackle with McEwen coming in here. He's just a very, very versatile offensive lineman that is effective. He was very effective playing that center role in 2019 as well, and we'll see how he does moving out to tackle full time, but I have a lot of confidence in him because he's just such a technically strong player and doesn't really have a weakness too much to his game. He's very quick for that center position when he was playing there, so I think he has that agility to play that tackles position on the outside. So really good core 3 players there that really bring up this unit's rank. And then you got guys like Justin Lawrence, who they're really relying on to take a big leap this season. Lawrence was a 5th round pick in 2018 out of Alberta. Saw some time primarily at that center spot when Williams went down for a few games in that 2019 season, and can play a little bit of a guard. He's probably going to be positioned at that left guard position vacated by Shane Bergman. So we'll see how he does this season, really depending on him to take a big leap to fill that void there. Leon Johnson, probably the projected starter here at right tackle. He's a practice roster holdover from 2019 that played left tackle well at the University of Temple. So we'll see how he does playing the right tackle role rather than the left tackle spot, but probably the favorite to take that job with Casatati retiring. And then Zach Williams out of Manitoba, a 3rd round pick in 2019 for Calgary, and played 2 games as a rookie, so he was able to get onto the field a little early in his career. And then Jordan Morgan from Kutztown, another practice squad holdover from 2019. Don't know too much about him, but again, going to be in the mix for competing for these roles because there are a couple open positions here on this offensive line. And then DJ Coker, who actually played his college football at Division III Rhodes College and was named an All-American his last 2 seasons there. So a guy that's really overachieved his recruiting profile, and I'm excited to see if he makes the roster here. And then you have a guy like Bryce Bell, who I accidentally skipped over here, was a 2nd round pick in this most recent CFL draft out of Wilfrid Laurier. Excited to see what he brings to the table. I had him mocked in my one and only mock draft higher than when he ended up going. So maybe he's a guy that, ends up being a little bit of a steal here for Calgary in the 2nd round and ends up having some playing time as a rookie. Now, on the defensive line, they're going to rank 8th, and this is mostly due to the fact that they don't really have much of a presence on the edge. But I do like the interior of this defensive line. So we'll start with Mike Rose and Derek Wigan. They're starting defensive tackles. We know this. So we'll start with Mike Rose, a guy that really is quick at the defensive tackle position. Just super effective, pretty versatile guy, can play a little bit of snaps at edge if you need him to, but he's more effective inside at that defensive tackle position where he can really take advantage of those offensive linemen that are a little bit slower. So probably the best pass rusher for this defensive line overall. He's also an excellent special teams player, I might add. Actually plays on the kick coverage team and is very effective at doing that. So he's quite an athlete at the defensive tackle spot. And then Derek Wigan, a Canadian defensive tackle that is more of a run stuffer kind of guy, doesn't provide too much as a pass rusher, but ultimately plays a capable role for this defensive line as just that guy that is going to take up double teams in the middle of the defense and be that solidifying force. But then on the edge, the number 1 projected defensive end for this unit is for Lauren Arl-Malati. Hasn't seen too much time over the past few seasons and has looked decent when he has been out there. He has a couple sacks, but we'll see how he does going out there again as a bigger role and bigger expectations. So with Earl Malati being the number 1 defensive end here, you just know it's going to be a pretty weak defensive line group, and there are a lot of questions here, starting with MB Tanye, a 2019 practice roster guy who played for the University of Maryland. Don't know too much about him, but he's in the mix here as a kind of an incumbent guy that the team is very familiar with. And then you have Isaac Ademi Berglund, who was this team's 1st round pick in the 2020 CFL draft, waiting to make his debut. Was super high on him going into the draft. I think depending on how the ratio works out for the team, that he could be starting for this team by season's end because of how weak this defensive end group is. And then you got Connor McGuff, a good Canadian depth defensive lineman here that's going to play a bit of special teams and contribute as a rotational guy, but kind of a tweener. He's not really a great defensive tackle, but he's not really a great end either. He's kind of in between. He can play some snaps at either or, but just not dominant at either one thing. So he's a good backup to have here. I wouldn't necessarily want to start him in this defense, but he was an addition in 2020 coming over from Hamilton. And then you have Stephon Banks, who is another guy who has been on the team's roster since 2020, waiting to make his CFL debut. And then Vincent Desjardins, the team's second-round pick in 2019. He dressed for 11 games as a rookie, didn't really see a ton of playing time, but we'll see how he does going into the future here. He has an opportunity to kind of make his way into playing time in this unit, so we'll see how he does there. And then Uric Bethune, he's only really interesting because he was on the Tiger Cats practice roster in 2019, so a guy that has a little bit of familiarity with the Canadian game. But overall, just a pretty inexperienced line outside of Rose and Wigan at the top here, so that's why they ranked 8th in the CFL. Now, to brighten up the conversation, we'll go on to the linebacker position, where they're going to rank 4th in the CFL, and just a really good veteran core 3 linebackers here. So we'll start with Jamar Wall, who plays the strong side linebacker for this unit. Just a very, very solid strong side linebacker. Doesn't do a whole lot in terms of flashiness or such, but he's played that role very capably over the past few years for Calgary. Just a veteran guy that they're going to really rely on with a lot of new faces coming into this team this year. And then Jameer Thurman, he comes back from the XFL after having an outstanding season back in 2018 with the Calgary Stampeders. He comes back, and I'm really excited to see how he does. He was a dynamic linebacker at the CFL level before, and he was actually very good in the XFL as well with the DC Defenders. He had a pick 6 in one of their games. So he was asked actually at training camp just a few days ago what his goals were for this season. He was saying he wanted to be Defensive Player of the Year in the CFL, and I think that is actually very achievable, especially for getting the nomination for this team, as we'll talk about later on. And then Corey Greenwood, a guy that, I made a video specifically about him on this channel. Go check that out once you're done watching this. The thing with him is just totally injuries, right? He has always had injuries at every step of the way, but when he's actually on the field, he's a very good linebacker, and he was leading this team, and I believe maybe the whole CFL, if I'm remembering correctly, in tackles midway through the 2019 season before suffering an injury. And I'm excited to see that Corey Greenwood is back in the fold here. And if he stays healthy, he's a very good middle linebacker for this group. So you have a really good core 3 linebackers here. And then behind it, you have some interesting young depth here. So Fraser Sopik, really dynamic special teams player as a rookie coming out of Western. We'll see if he gets any kind of expanded role on the defensive side. But at the very least, you have a great special teams player there in Sopik. And then Charlie Moore was a mid-round pick this year in the draft. We'll see what he brings to the table as a rookie. And then Corey James, a 2016 NFL 6th round pick who has over 100 career NFL tackles. A little bit of actual on-field experience there in his pro career. So we'll see if that translates to a decent CFL career as well. And then Silas Stewart, he played his college football as an outside linebacker with Incarnate Word. And that's really all I know about him. But I just wanted to throw another name up here to familiarize ourselves with some of these American players that are coming in here as rookies here for the Stampeders. Now, at defensive back, they're going to rank 3rd in the CFL, and there are not a lot of names listed here, but that's because I just kind of wanted to talk about the relevant ones and maybe a couple names we aren't too familiar with here. So we'll start with Richard Leonard, comes over from the Hamilton Tiger Cats, was a big core piece of that defensive back unit in 2019 as a corner. Kind of a smaller cornerback, but is very physical at the line of scrimmage and has the athleticism to keep up with some of the faster receivers in the league. So big addition there for Calgary. And then Deshaun Amos, he actually got a contract after the 2019 season in the NFL. I forget with who, but gets cut and he comes back here without missing a game for Calgary. Was dynamic, had a handful of interceptions in 2019, and was a big piece, kind of overshadowed by Trey Roberson, who was the best corner, arguably, in the CFL in 2019, who's still hanging around in the NFL. But Amos was a huge piece of this unit in 2019 as well, so it was huge to get him back at that halfback position. And then Brandon Dozier comes in here from BC, potentially as a safety here or half here, but is a former divisional all-star that brings a lot to the table in terms of range and coverage ability. So very, very good first three guys here in the defensive back room for the Calgary Stampeders. And then Royce Metchie, the Canadian starter in this secondary, very effective safety. I don't know if he gets moved around with Dozier coming in here, but had a really effective season in 2019, has a lot of good coverage range. Maybe his physical side isn't as apparent sometimes, but in terms of the coverage ability, that is the key thing. He can cover a lot of grass for this unit and is a very worthy starter in this secondary. And then Raheem Wilson is likely going to figure in as the other corner for this unit. Not too much to say about him, but just a pretty effective corner when he did see playing time in 2019. This was just a pretty good secondary in general, so the holdovers here generally have good things to say about them. And the additions of Dozier and Leonard just huge for this unit. Jonathan Moxey, a guy that came to the CFL in 2019 and even broke into the lineup for a handful of games as a rookie, so good signs there. Does he stick around for another season here? We'll see. And does he compete for that other corner role with Raheem Wilson? And then Greg Dukra, a guy that I thought was worth mentioning because he's a little bit older. He's been on a pro practice roster every year since 2014, but hasn't seen much game action at all really as a pro, so we'll see if he finally gets a breakout here, now almost 30 here. But overall, I just really like this defensive back unit, and that's why it ranks 3rd in the CFL. Now on special teams, they're going to rank 7th in the CFL, and I'm kind of split on this special teams unit because there are a few questions, but there's also a stud there on Rene Paredes, so we'll start with him first of all. Really good place kicker, been super consistent, one of the most consistent kickers in CFL history, and he's just going to do his job. But unfortunately, he doesn't also punt. So they actually had a big retirement of Rob Maver, who was just a very consistent punter for this team. And so they have to replace what he brings to the table. I think Ronnie Peffer is probably the most likely to take that punting job because he has CFL experience. But you also have other guys here like Kieran Burnham and Cody Grace, who I believe was their first-round pick this year in the CFL Global Draft, to compete for that punting job. We'll see what happens there, but the punting situation is kind of up in the air there. That drags it down a bit for me. And then Aaron Crawford is their long snapper they bring over from Hamilton. For kick returners, I didn't really know what to put because there's not a lot of guys that have had a history of returning kicks. Josh Huff is the main guy I can think of because of what he was able to do as a kick returner a bit during the 2019 season when he came over as a rookie, but we'll see if he does that with an expanded role on offense. Maybe Markeith Ambles, but I don't know if they'll trust a guy with that inconsistent hands returning kicks on a consistent basis. So a lot of things up in the air in terms of the return room, but I mean, it's not the most important position in the world, but you like to have a guy that's going to make an impact right at that spot because you never know when you can need a big return here or there in the CFL, and it happens much more regularly than it does in American football. So that's the main question I have for this unit. Not really an established good return man for this team, so that's why it's going to rank 7th in the CFL. And on top of that, you have the punter questions as well. Now moving on to the projected starters for the Calgary Stampeders. So we'll start with the wide receiver room. So Kamara Jordan, Markeith Ambles, Herja Mayala, Josh Huff. I think those guys are pretty well settled in as the starters at the receiver position. But Dorian Baker is the other guy I have penciled in here. I think he's going to start at that wide receiver position just because he's kind of a bigger body guy that fits the profile of that receiver that doesn't run the waggle in the CFL, but is able to hold up physically on the outside and win those contested matchups when they do throw the ball his way. And I think he's going to be willing to play that role as a guy that really was pretty unselfish when he played in college, didn't really get the ball thrown to him a whole ton. So I think he's the guy there. I don't know for sure, obviously. I think they could go a lot of different ways with that spot with a lot of the other receivers they have in camp. We'll see what Calgary decides to do. And then on the offensive line, I think 4 of the 5 starters are pretty well set in stone, but that right tackle spot, I'm not too certain what's going to happen there. Leon Johnson is the presumed guy because he's been around the team for the last couple of years here. We'll see how that plays out. That's going to be a true training camp battle there. And then Bo Levi, Kadeem Carey, I think are pretty well settled in as the starters there. Obviously, Bo Levi, what am I saying? Now on defense, this might be the unit that we've looked at so far in this series that has been the most settled, except for those defensive end spots that I've talked about before. So Mike Rose, Jarek Wigan are going to be the inside starters, as I've discussed before. But Folarin Aralomalati and MB Tani, I think any of these guys that come in here as roster bodies here in training camp could potentially steal one of these defensive end jobs because none of these guys are proven guys at the CFL level. So that is the big question mark for this defense. But otherwise, I think everything else is set for this defensive front here for the Calgary Stampeders. So Jameer Thurman, Corey Greenwood, Jamar Wall, your clear starters at linebacker. And then I think those are your main five guys in the secondary with Raheem Wilson, Deshaun Amos, Royce Metchie, Brandon Dozier, and Richard Leonard. So just a really settled unit. I don't really have much to say. Just those defensive end spots are going to be very interesting to see what Calgary decides to do. Now moving on to my team award predictions for this season. And once again, for most outstanding player, I'm going with the quarterback. Again, very easy to do, but it just seems like the obvious choice in this case. And I'm going with Bo Levi Mitchell. I think he's in for a really big season, and I think this team is going to ride or die with him every week. And he's going to be throwing the ball a ton, as they usually do in Calgary. But then, most outstanding defensive player, I'm going with Jameer Thurman at linebacker, coming back to the CFL here in 2021. Just think he's going to put up some monster stat lines, and that's usually what gets people nominated for the award. And I really don't see one defensive lineman or one defensive back in particular standing out and getting a lot of the statistics needed to be nominated for the award. So I'm going with Jameer Thurman there. And then for most outstanding Canadian, I'm going with Herji Mayala. I think, as I said before, is going to be, by the end of the season, the best Canadian receiver in the CFL. I just think he has so much potential as that really big receiver in this offense. And he also has great chemistry already with Bo Levi Mitchell that we saw at the end of that 2019 season. So I think he's in for a huge year. And then I forgot to put most outstanding offensive lineman here, but I'm going with Convery Williams just because he's making that shift out from center to left tackle. I think they're going to really appreciate that when they do their nomination process. I think he's going to be a big part of what they do. And then most outstanding rookie, I'm going with Isaac Ademi Berglund, was their first round pick in 2020. And I think by the end of the season, he could potentially be a starter for this unit on the defensive line if it works out for them ratio-wise, and at the very least, I think he's going to be a rotational pass rusher for this group. Now moving on to my final thoughts for the Calgary Stampeders going into the 2021 season. So we'll start with the key question, and as we've discussed throughout this review, there are a lot of positions on this roster that are kind of lacking depth and experience at the CFL level, and to that end, the question is, can Bo Levi Mitchell stay healthy? It's really what all this thing rides on for the Calgary Stampeders going into this season. I don't think if Bo goes down that this team can stay afloat. I just think there's too much inexperience throughout this roster. The whole thing would snowball, and Bo Levi is really the guy that is keeping this era of Calgary Stampeders football together from their dominant years a few years ago. So I think so much rides on him. If he's healthy, I think this team can really overachieve what a lot of people are saying that they're going to achieve this season. But if he's not, I don't think this team is a playoff team. I think they're easily the worst team in the West if he suffers some kind of major injury early on in the season. So that leads me to my general prediction, and that's that the Calgary Stampeders this year, I see as a fringe playoff team. I put there that crossover is potentially the destination here for the Stampeders this season, but I don't know for sure if that's going to happen with how few games they're going to be playing against the other division in comparison to previous years with the more divisionally focused schedule. I don't know how the crossover is going to potentially work out. So I think they're a fringe playoff team that could potentially miss out in any given scenario. I don't think this roster is necessarily good enough to compete with a lot of the other rosters that I've been looking at around the CFL this year. But there's so many teams that are in the mix right now. It's really hard to try to split hairs and determine who's going to really succeed this season because we've seen so much time off and the 2019 season was so weird. I think this team is a team I could be very wrong about. I think they could easily be potentially the best team in the West again if everything breaks right and if Bo Levi is really his former self in the West. It's going to be tough to make the playoffs there, but you'll just have to let me know your thoughts in the comment section about this team going into this season. But with that said, that is going to be the end of this video, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Once again, my name is Jason. If you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is by hitting that like button and subscribing to Untitled for more CFL content just like this. I appreciate all the support. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.